Okay. Well, this is my first time using YouTube Live, so I hope this goes well. I can see there are some people that are watching, so that's excellent. This is kind of our first foray into this sort of fireside chat type discussion. I hope to have guests on further ones, but I encountered a publication that was just so enlightening and so interesting that I wanted to share some knowledge from that. If you follow with our Instagram at Reflex app IO, you've probably already seen some information relating to that. And we're just going to go a lot deeper into it because I think it's a ton of fun. Um, we have a chat that you can utilize to interact with me. So, like I said, in the future, we'll have guests. We might do like a Zoom thing where people raise their hands. I just didn't know how this platform really worked that well. So, I think that it's only me, and we're just going to be basically doing a lecture, unfortunately. But given that, I guess let's just kind of dive in and feel free to say stuff as things come along. I'm happy to answer any questions as we kind of work through some of the things that I have prepared. And yeah, let's just kind of dive in a little bit. So I shared just a few days ago that Mr. Robert Witt, he was born in 1714, uh, and he was regarded as probably the first person recorded to utilize pupillary light reflex testing. Um, it's a pretty interesting notion that he came up with, but we're actually not going to start there. We're going to start a little sooner than that, and we'll get back to that one because that was the 18th century. And I'm a big history buff, and all of this is super compelling to me, especially given what we do. And I found that even earlier in the 16th century, there was a guy um, that Galen was mentioned in the Hippocratic writings. I think that these were from 1510 to 1590 from Ambroise Parr. Yes, and in these they documented some observations around neurological aberrations and hematomas and things like that, but they never actually described anything relating to the pupils and anisocoria and all of that, which was really interesting. Like they got really close. They knew of the pupils, they knew why it was important, but they never really wrote it down. There's some evidence to suggest that they had some of that knowledge. And then there was a German-esque type depiction in 1517 that there were surgical cases that had elevated anisocoria. And so that is the first ever documented evidence that we have of somebody actually utilizing pupils and anisocoria to determine some sort of diagnosis. And so I just thought that that was super enlightening. That it honestly, given the quickness of medical history, that was a long time ago. 16th century in medicine is honestly forever ago. And so there was a period of 200 years, if you could believe it, before we got to our next big adventure, which was Dr. Robert Witt. And he studied something from what he called was sympathy. And I think that should sound extremely familiar, right? Given the sympathetic side of the nervous system and the parasympathetic. And he noticed that with light stimulating the eyes, he wanted to research that and try to understand why that would be relevant or meaningful. And he found a hydrocephalic child. I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly. And the pupils didn't react to the light. And he started postulating why that might be. And his essential reasoning was that the pathways, they had been interrupted in some way or another. He didn't necessarily understand the mechanism in which they occurred, and he didn't understand how that pathway was implemented within the brain itself. But he did come to the conclusion, and a correct conclusion, that there was, a challenge with the hydrocephalopathy, I think is what it might be. That just fixated the pupils, and that's kind of where it ended for him. He actually was a Scottish professor at Edinburgh in theory of medicine, and he did a lot to advance ocular testing, ophthalmology, optometrics, all that good stuff. But then we get to our good friend Mr. Herbert Mayo. Hopefully that name sounds familiar. And he was the one that really started determining what these pathways looked like in the brain. Um, so we had Dr. Robert Witt, and he speculated essentially some pathways, but he only had evidence, empirical evidence that he received from some of his testing. But Dr. Mayo, he came to the conclusion that there was an eye and a midbrain, and that through his preparations, he found these what he calls optic tubercles. I believe that's how you might say it. And I do apologize if I pronounce anything incorrectly. I'm an engineer by trade, and this stuff is just really interesting to me. So if you know the correct pronunciation, please correct me in the chat. Um, and these were kind of the first foray into what he found as far as like the optic nerves connections and cranial nerve. I think it's cranial nerve 3, and how that would all play a crucial role in the pupillary light reflex and interconnectivity. But very, very soon after him. So he actually passed away in 1856. But probably about 50 years later, yeah, just about 50 years later, in 1885, Ludwig Edinger, and Edinger should sound familiar. He was colleagues with a man named Carl Westphal, and the Ludwig Edinger, he is the one that really identified the midbrain nucleus, which I think you can see where we're going with this. And the colleague of his, so he confirmed, he discovered it, and then Carl Westphal, he confirmed the findings. But the thing was that Edinger, he only found these findings in children. He actually didn't study adults. And then it was further confirmed in Westphal's work that adults also exhibited the same connections and had the same nucleus. So that is what we now commonly refer to as the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. And this has just stayed with us ever since, right? As it should, with a lot of common research discoveries that we keep names with. So yeah, I mean, they're a German powerhouse, right? They're the ones that figured out a lot of the internet connectivity relating to the midbrain and the eyes. And then we have another Scottish. The Scottish were just, the Scots were just amazing in their work surrounding this. He was an ophthalmologist, and it's Mr. Robert Marcus Gunn. Way back in 1902. That wasn't that far back ago. And he essentially came up with what we call as the Marcus Gunn pupil. Now, this is something that I think a lot of optometrists, ophthalmologists are super familiar with, especially functional neurologists as well. Basically, what it means is that it's normal to constrict, similarly abnormal to dilate whenever you're moving to the other eye using a swing light test. Now, this is more colloquially known as the afferent pupillary defect. But it does have a name that isn't just the afferent pupillary defect. It is also the Marcus Gunn pupil. And I never really connected those two dots before. So, I mean, light research can tell you that, but this is, something that I'm just a little new to as far as the history relating to all of it. And so then, sticking with the same vein in the 19th century, we're going to keep moving along. The Douglas Argyll Robertson. Now, that one actually didn't strike me as familiar, which is, regular. I mean, that's not that insane, but maybe this one sounds familiar to you all. It's the AR pupil. And this is a disorder that was described, way back in the very late 1800s. Also studied at Edinburgh, and this particular disorder basically means that the pupil does not constrict with light, but it constricts with accommodation. So that's a really unique situation, right? It might just be the only situation that I'm aware of, given my limited knowledge in medical applications for PLR, since we just fabricate the device itself. But yeah, the pupil, AR pupil, was actually one of the earliest diagnostic methods for syphilis. Apparently, that it was a common uh, mechanism for diagnosing syphilis. They didn't necessarily understand it at the time, and Dr. Robertson he coined the term spinal meiosis, and that just kind of evolved into AR pupil, and then what we utilize today as a common symptom for syphilis that's moved into the neurological tract. And then this one, and I promise that we're getting kind of close to the end as far as history relating to pupils. I'm sure it's exceedingly deep, but these are just the examples that I could find in literature. And just for your benefit, the paper that I'm referencing, it's called Historical Roots of the Visual Examination. And it was put together by Dr. Peter Kohler. I'll post something about that on our Instagram, and maybe I'm actually thinking about doing a blog post that kind of details a lot of this stuff as well. But what we found was, in reviewing this, that it had just a lot of deep knowledge, not just in pupils. So it's highly worth the read. But I couldn't find other deep any other deeper information from a publication perspective, at least not in time for our discussion today, to really go into deep detail past the examples that I've given. But moving on with our historical tour, this is kind of our last stop in the 19th century. So Perinaud, this Perinaud syndrome, discovered by Henry Perinaud. He was an ophthalmologist at Charcot's Neurological Clinic. I hope I'm pronouncing that one right. But that was in Paris, and he was like hyper fixated on diseases of eye movements and how those translated into neurological conditions, and he just wanted to understand how this would be relevant in his work. And what he found was kind of a discovery in convergence insufficiency. Now, we lightly touched on this a little bit earlier with the AR pupil. And some of this stuff happens simultaneously. As common knowledge suggests, right, in research today, there's a lot of discoveries that happen like even within the same year, sometimes as crazy as within days of one another. We've all heard those stories, even in the news. And I think that this falls within the same realm relating to convergence. But we to continue on with Henry Perinaud's discovery. I mean, this convergence insufficiency and difficulty looking up. So patients would often exhibit diplopia, and which would mean, like I think blurred vision is what that means, or double vision. And then somewhat unreactive pupils. And this one is actually a type of palsy, interestingly enough. And you can see, I looked it up earlier, there are images, kind of like an array of images where they're showing the test being conducted. What they'll do is they'll hold the eyes up like this and then have them look up, but they're incapable of doing so. A really, really interesting exhibition of that particular disease. Yeah, so like an interesting take on something that I honestly didn't know about. I didn't know that a type of palsy could exhibit itself in that manner. And then this is the last stop, unfortunately, in our little historical journey. Now we'll obviously keep talking and hanging out, but this one should be hyper familiar to everyone. So it's Addy's pupil. That was discovered by William John Addy. He was born in 1886. Again, studied in Edinburgh. I believe they had an insane medical university there, and the college was kind of like a powerhouse relating to not only optometric conditions but medical conditions, or optometric and neurooptometric conditions, but also medical conditions in general. And he often practiced at the National Hospital in London, but he found myotonic pupils. And Addy's pupil, it's a form of anisocoria, which Reflex it will automatically calculate for you. And I believe the stat is like 20% of the population exhibits some form of anisocoria just naturally, because it's clinically defined as a difference of 1 millimeter. But we all have a hard time distinguishing just with our eyes, 1 millimeter difference, which is why quantitative pupilometry is so important. And the Addis pupil is a little different. So with anisocoria, you can have parasympathetic excitement, right, where you have the pupil constricting more than what the other pupil is. This one is actually the opposite. I apologize. There's yard work going on outside. But the Addis pupil, it's actually a parasympathetic, or sorry, a sympathetic response, where the pupil is actually getting dilated more. So one pupil will be at its baseline, the other one will actually be blown out more. So that's the key difference between the two. I'd never known that before, just looking into it a little more. I've had discussions around the Addis pupil and anisocoria and just kind of like understanding implementations of reflex and how people utilize it. But I never really like formally understood the difference between those two. And so it was just really interesting. So, and I hope I didn't get my sides mixed up, but I do have noted here that it's a process of parasympathetic denervation. So yeah, it was a seminal paper in 1932 that was in Brain, and that's when they first coined Addis syndrome. So that is kind of all I had prepared from a historical perspective. But I believe the title of this is The Pupil Then and Now. And, since then, I mean, there's been major advancements, right? And not only in just optometrics and ophthalmology in general, but in the measurements or how we acquire those measurements over time. For about 100 years after people started discovering these different syndromes, like we talked about, we just ended with the 20th century, by the way, very early 20th century. That was kind of where the very unique aspects of the pupil kind of got flushed out. Now, obviously, we've had more use cases, utility discovered since then for how we monitor pupils and track them. But those came along with new acquisition methods, all the way up until like 1910. People were just doing the same thing with pen lights, and they would do swinging light tests. Was probably the latest advancement ahead of actual quantitative pupilometry. And then computers and new like screen technology and cameras and infrared emittance and things like that, those all really accelerated the inventions and ideas in which we'd acquire more information regarding the pupil. And that has made us obviously better in medicine as a society in our ability to characterize different disease states. It doesn't have to be with the pupils, right? These massive advancements in computer technology and cameras ever since like the 1950s, right, have essentially allowed us to have more accurate measures relating to all the conditions that the eyes and the brain and the rest of the body is exhibiting. And so then, lo and behold, somebody comes with the great idea, the invention of utilizing a camera and some, novel computer techniques at the time in order to determine what would be like pupil size. And you can do this dynamically. You can do this over time, and you can do it for however long you want. We'll get more into that here in a minute. And originally, actually, what they would do is they would just kind of hand measure them, because they didn't have really the calculation methods, the implementation of computer code and all of that. If you think but way back to dial-up, whenever we had the websites, they were so much clunkier than what they are today. That's just because people they hadn't blossomed into the stylistic calculative methods to be able to do these mathematical styled operations, especially for extracting information. And the pupilometers hit the scene, and they're very manual. I was trying to find an example of one earlier, and honestly, I couldn't find a good reference example for one that would be measuring of the pupil and then doing or reading of the pupil with the camera and doing hand measurements on some sort of device or printing them out and doing it in that manner. But the next one is, the hardware style camera technologies, the ones where you can like hold the the big clunky thing. Like I have my graphing calculator right here that I use every now and again, and they look like, kind of like this, right? You have a screen here, you have a big honking camera on the back of it, you have like buttons and stuff that you can interact with. Very, very 1980s, right? Technology, very early 1990s technology. But it is in a nice consolidated form factor. At the time, what a insanely relevant piece of equipment, and what a great advancement. And this is when they started implementing a lot of the compute methods that are commonplace today in infrared type readings. They call it well, there's actually a few methods, but I think the most relevant one's the canny method in order to do edge detection. There are other ways you can do this, but really it's just putting in a high contrast filter on a video, and then you kind of find where the circles are at. That's really all it does. It works really well in an infrared setting, but I mean, the reason why we're here today, the reason why Reflex exists today, is because it's too old school. We're kind of at a pivotal moment in computer vision and even AI. Really, at this point, I'm sure all of you are incredibly aware of everything that relates to the AI of the world today. We're not even going to mention the GPT features that are out there, because I'm sure you're all sick of it. But yeah, in computer vision, I mean, we can make significant advancements to where we don't necessarily need these big honking things, right? We now have, as a very great example, this graphing calculator. We now have the ability to just have this graphing calculator on our phone. And not only does it do that, but it does a whole bunch of other junk, right? These are still really helpful in situations where I don't have, I guess a phone with me, but that's pretty much never, right? We all have our phones or iPads with us everywhere we go. So these things are becoming obsolete, unfortunately. They're quite useful, but they're just not as good. We've evolved. We've moved on. That's kind of when our technology kind of splashed in. Now, people had poked around with this in the past. They utilized their like webcams pretty much, and they could like read in the face. It'd be like high res webcams, and they would like sit pretty close to it, have a little chin rest right there. And this is where we talk about the dynamic operation of people over very long time periods. And they could do tasking with it. They could do like emotional categorization. They could do all sorts of cool stuff with it because it was plugged into a desktop in a static fashion. And you had like all the camera, the equipment, and all this other stuff. And then they went a little further and they said, well, what if we mount this to the head? And we even see this today. There's actually terrific companies that are out there today. There's one for gaming called Tobii, Tobii. And you can place it on your head. I think it's actually closer to maybe a pair of glasses. And it's got cameras that look in and they do eye tracking type movements, but I believe they do pupil size as well. Terrific company, more focused on gaming, but I believe that they're doing some really cool and interesting things relating around medicine as well. And we've seen this with a lot of technologies, even with like VR headsets, like SyncThink and other similar great technologies. But these are clunky, right? They got to go on the head. It's more equipment you have to buy, and they have a fixed environment, which makes it relatively easy for them to capture data. Now, I'm not saying that the product itself and building it's not easy at all. I mean, they're terrific products, but the actual acquisition of that data in those closed environments is relatively easy. And then you have some people that play with more of the visual field, or sorry, not visual field, but the visible spectrum of light. And they could kind of get it to work. It had to be like kind of in the absolute perfect lighting, absolute perfect angle. There's tons of examples online. You can just go on like Google and just type in like publication for desktop mounted visible spectrum PLR or something like that, and you'll get like all these articles that are relevant in this world, but they're not necessarily useful because they're like research projects. They're things that people were interested in at the time, but they could never really get a commercial product off the ground, and they didn't understand really the form factor that was necessary to start making critical advancements. And finally, with our last 5 minutes, we get to Reflex. Um, and that is where we kind of elevated the game a little bit, right? We said not only can we do what everybody else is doing, and we can do it free form, so you don't have a fixed piece of equipment that you have to set up and have in front of the patient, put your chin on, and all that stuff. But you also have uh, in a convenient form factor, which is an iPhone or an iPad. A really interesting concept, a really interesting notion, and medicine has kind of been traipsing in this way. I don't think it's necessarily been as explosive as what everybody was suggesting maybe like 5 years ago, but it certainly generated a lot of useful tools that you otherwise couldn't have had. A good example of this is that I don't know if they're still in existence, but there was like a nursing communication platform called Volt, and nurses would be on their iPhones. They could have compliant communication between them, the doctors, and all of that, and very helpful technology. But and we had those mole evaluation methods with cameras on the phone, and it could like classify if your mole might be cancerous or not. And those like kind of never really took off, right? I think you can still find them on the App Store, but they're just classifiers, not very interesting, and they don't have really great accuracy. If I remember correctly, they were more like the 80s, 80% accuracy. So that's what's interesting about Reflex is it's kind of one of the very few, might only be the only one that I'm aware of that is the medical device and the calculation method and like the acquisition tool as well for the data, similar to the mole evaluation, but with a higher accuracy, right? We have a 3% mean average error, or actually, sorry, mean absolute error, which is even more impressive. And yeah, we're able to generate these impressive results and lighting conditions that are, like right now I'm being blinded by the sun. You could take a reflex test right now on me, and it's almost guaranteed chance that it'll work. So yeah, and we've been able to kind of change the game a little bit, change the game on how this type of service is delivered to a patient. It's sleeker, it's sexier, it's no longer the big fat graphing calculator, and it's really allowed us to um, kind of make this nice advancement to where you can have a pupilometer in your pocket. You no longer have to like go across the way and grab the piece of equipment, sign it out, hold it up to the patient's face, and do all that junk. Which, by the way, they're subject to their own errors because they have relevant distance from the eye and the brow. Um, and we just kind of lock in with spatial locking and fixate and get the data as it's shown, as it's exhibited, all within about a second usually. So yeah, that's kind of the end of our discussion. We have 2 minutes left. If there is just any sort of comments that are out there that you guys want to float by, or questions that you might want to ask me, we're going to try and do these. I'll try to do them once a week. I'll try to have guests on. I'll also try to maybe do like live demos of the product as well, just for people to pop in and out if they think it would be useful. But yeah, given that, and I'm not seeing any chats coming in, thank you all so much for your time. This was, I think an incredibly fun experience, at least for me. I got to interact with the new technology. I got to study some really, really interesting things, and I'll send maybe some of this out via email. But yeah, it's been fun, and maybe on the next one we'll do it a little later, and we can. Oh yeah, you're quite welcome. You're quite welcome. And we'll put it into a blog post, and you can share it around. But bring some friends along with you next time. Maybe we'll get this house a little more packed. But with that, I think why don't we sign off? Everyone have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye now.